On science, space, and technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Good morning to you all, and welcome to today's hearing entitled America's Human Presence in Low Earth Orbit. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. Our nation faces important questions about future space exploration. Will the International Space Station stop receiving federal support in 2025? If so, under what conditions? What is the future of America's human presence in low Earth orbit? Beyond that, what is the future of human presence on the Moon and Mars? The International Space Station has been authorized and funded to operate until 2024. Decisions about the long-term future of the ISS impact the future of America's human space exploration program. Unless NASA's budget is significantly increased, there are not enough funds both to maintain direct federal support for the ISS and return American astronauts to the surface of the Moon in the 2020s. And without a sharp increase in funding for NASA, we cannot ensure American leadership in human deep space exploration in the next decade and beyond. NASA announced an ISS transition plan at the end of March. According to the proposal, the United States should not continue direct federal support for ISS operation beyond 2024. The private sector, commercial space, may well pick up where NASA left off. In addition to the transition of the ISS, a related but important question is the future of America's human presence in low Earth orbit. After 2025, should Americans maintain some human presence in low Earth orbit, even on a limited basis? But having, quote, American human presence in low Earth orbit does not necessarily mean continuing to operate the ISS. Discussing continued human presence and continued operation of the ISS are related but distinct subjects. Existing law can help guide this discussion. The 2017 NASA Transition Authorization Act reaffirms the principle of continuity of purpose. It also establishes that extending human presence throughout the solar system is a long-term goal for NASA. It directs NASA to follow a stepping stone approach to exploration. This involves expanding human presence from low Earth orbit to the Moon, from the Moon to Mars, and then from Mars to other bodies throughout the solar system. The 2018 NASA Authorization Act was approved by the Science Committee on a bipartisan vote, and the Act supports the administration's transition plan in fiscal year 2019. It's my hope that this hearing will help us evaluate the transition of the ISS and continued American presence in low Earth orbit. And that concludes my statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all, and welcome to our distinguished witnesses. I'm pleased that you're holding this hearing, America's Human Presence in Low Earth Orbit. In 1991, the House voted for the first time to reject an attempt to cancel the space station program. More attempts were made to cancel the space program in subsequent years, but each time it was kept alive. Those votes to continue the space station weren't easy ones, given a series of redesigns, cost growth, and other challenges with the program during that development. I mention this history, Mr. Chairman, because had Congress not made a commitment to support the space station and later to extend its operations, we could well have missed acquiring essential knowledge about how to live and safely work in the low Earth orbit and beyond. We also would have missed an opportunity to inspire our young people to excel, something the International Space Station continues to do in classrooms across the nation. I might add that the 6 school districts in my district has had the opportunity to have visits with astronauts in the space station, and they were all very, very excited. And I believe that out of that experience, many of them will think of a future to use a background in STEM education. Without the International Space Station, Would we have a durable, multi-nation international partnership that has strengthened this nation, its global leadership, and the vision of peaceful cooperation in outer space? Would we have laid the groundwork for developing a commercial resupply service and soon a commercial crew transportation capability that can help enable sustained commercial engagement in low Earth orbit? Looking ahead, as we debate the future of the International Space Station, we find ourselves facing a decision of equal importance to the one we faced in 1991. The NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017 established the long-term goal of sending humans to Mars. We know that such a multi-decadal understanding will be challenging and expensive, and achieving it will be even more challenging if we are also continuing to support the estimated $3 to $3 billion annual cost of keeping the International Space Station operating. At the same time, the space station supports important research and engineering activities, both public and private, and provides a stepping stone for exploration. For that reason, the Transition Act also called for an International Space Station transition plan to establish an orderly process by which alternative orbital platforms may be considered and potentially brought on as replacements for the International Space Station. Although we only recently received the plan, the administration decided in its fiscal year 2019 budget request to propose ending direct federal funding of the International Space Station in 2025. This is a bold proposal and one that raises a lot of questions. Mr. Chairman, the future of the International Space Station is of great consequence to our continued leadership in space exploration and utilization. Decisions as to its funding should not be made lightly, not without sufficient information and debate. As members of the Science Committee, we need to roll up our sleeves, ask the right questions, and focus on the core issues needing our attention. In that regard, I hope this morning's hearing will shed light on, 1, the cost of conducting research on the space station versus alternative model platform, whether the commercial market will be ready to support a purely commercial space station in 2025 without direct U.S. government funding, or if not, what level of government funding would be needed. 3, whether a national laboratory in low Earth orbit should be continued following the end of the space station operations, and for the conditions and resources that would be needed to transition basic and applied biological and physical sciences research to a commercial or non-governmental platform. In closing, Mr. Chairman, there's a lot we need to examine as we contemplate the future of the International Space Station. I hope this morning's discussion is just the first of a series of hearings so that committee members will have the chance to ask questions to the other International Space Station stakeholders who are not represented today. We will need that information if we are to move forward with a thoughtful and constructive NASA authorization bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And the chairman of the Space Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The International Space Station, or the ISS, is the crown jewel of America's human spaceflight program. As a representative of Johnson Space Center in Houston, I am proud of the leadership role that Johnson has with the ISS and American human space exploration in general. I'm keenly aware of the importance of the International Space Station to the hard-working professionals at JSC. For them, the ISS is more than just a program of record. It is part of their being. This is why I take, with the utmost seriousness, the questions our committee must address on the future of the ISS and America's human spaceflight program. The Trump administration is a very strong advocate for human space exploration, and I support the administration's renewed focus I agree in broad terms with the human exploration plans the administration has outlined. I appreciate the administration's invitation to discuss and mature plans for our civil space exploration program, including the ISS. However, we as a Congress have a responsibility to think through the issues on our own and reach our own conclusions, which is why that we are here today. I believe that doing exploration right means that anywhere we establish a human presence in space, we must fulfill two main objectives. First, we must make that presence sustainable. Second, we must use that presence as a jumping-off point to extend our reach even further. This discussion, along with maintaining continuity of purpose, are key themes in the 2018 NASA Authorization Act, recently passed out of this committee on a bipartisan vote. Section 202 of the Act on the ISS transition reflects a balance. It provides authority and guidance to the administration to carry out the initial steps of its ISS transition plans, but does so on a limited basis. It explicitly limits authorization to carry out the initial exploratory steps of the administration's plan to fiscal year 2019. Section 202 of the 2018 NASA Authorization Act is good policy that provides a strong foundation for Congress and the nation as we take our very next steps with the ISS and America's future human presence in LEO. 4 criteria that we may consider for evaluating success of an ISS transition. First, the United States must preserve its global leadership in space, and this means preserving our international partnerships as we continue forward. Second, our presence in LEO should support our journey to the moon and beyond. Third, staying in LEO should not preclude further human exploration for economic or other reasons. And fourth, as necessary to meet our national interests, we should maintain a regular human presence of America, whether public or private, whether permanent or periodic, in LEO. I can tell you that failure is not an option. I can also tell you that there are not a lot of scenarios in which a few $1 billion per year can magically be added to NASA's human spaceflight program. Therefore, we have only one option. We must figure out how to lead and cooperate with our private and international partners to make human presence in LEO sustainable. With commitment, we can successfully transition the ISS while maintaining American leadership in human spaceflight. In closing, I am proud that America has led and will continue to lead the human exploration of the cosmos. I will do everything in my power as chairman of the subcommittee to support NASA and American leadership in human space exploration. I thank the witnesses for their attendance, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. And the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee, Mr. Baer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member. Obviously, this is an incredibly important conversation that we're having in terms of what the transition plan is, and I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses. There's broad consensus and agreement both from the administration and from Congress that as a stretch mission, we're looking at human exploration and travel to Mars, as my colleague from Colorado would say, by 2033. And I think that is a good goal to set because, again, much as we did in the age of the Apollo missions, we didn't know how we were going to go to the moon, let alone how we were going to come back, but we set a goal. We put resources towards that goal. We worked towards it, and we accomplished it. And now we are setting a stretch goal to get to Mars, again, by 2033. As we set that goal, we don't know exactly how we're going to get there. We don't know exactly how we're going to return. We don't know, as a physician, what the human consequences and physiologic consequences of extended time and space is going to be, extended exposure to radiation, et cetera. To address these issues, we have to have a lab. Again, I'm going to approach this as an academic and, as a physician. to look at these issues. In addition, we don't know the technologies, et cetera. And again, we have to have some venue by which we can do these experiments and learn those technologies that allow us to go deeper into space. And in that sense, the ISS, since its completion in 2011, has given us a very unique asset by which to experiment, not just for our desire to go deeper into space. We've also been able to use the ISS as a unique laboratory to help us improve life on Earth, whether it's biomedical discoveries, whether it's other discoveries. It is a very unique asset, and I think that's why this is incredibly important for us to think about. Resources are always going to be tight, but how do we, not just if we have a workable asset in 2025, I think it would be unconscionable for us not to continue to say, okay, how do we continue to use this asset? Maybe it is, what aspect can the commercial sector pick up? What aspect can the international community pick up? But clearly there's a role for NASA as well, and unique capabilities that only NASA can provide. And again, I'm glad that we are taking up this conversation at this point in 2018, and we're not having this conversation in 2023. I think it's incredibly important for us to do this. I'll also just add one other component. A company that I had a chance to visit when I was down at NASA Ames to talk about why this is important was a company called Made in Space that is working on the NASA Ames facility, looking at 3D printing. I'm a pretty simple, I'm a doctor, not an engineer, but so 3D printing to me is 3D printing. But what they're actually doing is, what is 3D printing in a low gravity situation? How does that impact things? And some of the remarkable stuff that they're doing is they're also, if we have a lunar mission, we return to the moon, if they simulate the indigenous materials on the moon to do 3D printing, to use that to build whatever habitats on the moon, that's pretty remarkable. What that allows us to do is travel with much lighter payloads. If eventually we want to create something on Mars, again, you can't move all those payloads and move all that material, but if you can go to Mars, take indigenous materials, use that as your building blocks for whatever you're constructing, those are the technologies that, again, you can try to experiment on Earth, but it would be much better to be able to simulate that and build all of that in space. So I think the ISS, as someone who wants to figure out how we extend the life of the ISS and make this a workable asset until we have an adequate replacement at some time in the future, is something that Congress ought to support. And again, I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses as we think about this transition plan. And again, kudos to the chairman and ranking member for having us engage in this conversation in 2018 and not 2033 or 2023. Thank you. We'll be in Mars in 2033.
Thank you, Mr. Baer. Before I introduce our witnesses today, I'd like to welcome back a former member of the committee, and that is the gentleman from Alabama, Gary Palmer. Listen to the enthusiastic response. Gary was a member of the committee from 2015 to 2017, took a brief leave of absence, but he's returned to the fold, and so we welcome him back to the committee. I might also say, and I'll introduce her at our next hearing, she wasn't able to come today, that Debbie Lasko, the new member from Arizona, is also a member of the Science Committee, and we'll introduce her at the proper time. But Representative Palmer, welcome back to the Science Committee. Our first witness today is Mr. William Gerstenmaier, Associate Administrator of the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate at NASA. He provides strategic direction for all aspects of NASA's human exploration of space and programmatic direction for the continued operation and utilization of the ISS. Mr. Gerstenmaier began his NASA career in 1977 performing aeronautical research and has managed NASA's human spaceflight portfolio since 2011. He received a Bachelor's of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from Purdue University and a Master's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Toledo. Our second witness today is Dr. Bhavya Lal, research scientist at the Science and Technology Policy Institute at the Institute for Defense Analysis. STPI was established by Congress to support the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and other executive agencies. At STPI, Dr. Lal leads analysis of space technology, strategy, and policy for OSTP and the National Space Council, NASA, FAA, and other space-oriented federal agencies and departments. Dr. Lal holds a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Science in Nuclear Engineering from MIT, a second Master's of Science from MIT's Technology and Policy Program, and a PhD in Public Policy and Public Administration from George Washington University. Our third witness is Dr. Elizabeth R. Cantwell, CEO of the Arizona State University Research Enterprise and Professor of Practice in the School for Engineering of Matter, Transport, and Energy. Dr. Cantwell is responsible for leading the creation, management, and capture of large-scale, externally funded programs and projects that advance the university's research enterprise. Dr. Cantwell earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Human Behavior from the University of Chicago and a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. She also earned her PhD in Mechanical Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. We welcome you all, look forward to your testimony, and Mr. Gerstenmaier will begin with you.
Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this important hearing on America's human presence in low Earth orbit. The ISS has accomplished amazing things and transformed the way that we see human spaceflight. Crews have lived continuously on the ISS for almost 18 years. The ISS has enabled groundbreaking research that has benefited all of us. The ISS has helped NASA prepare for deep space missions. The ISS has allowed us to maintain a leadership role in international spaceflight. This International Space Station Partnership has developed voluntary standards, such as the International Docking Standard, that could transform spaceflight for decades to come. These standards will allow anyone to be part of spaceflight by simply designing to these standards. The cooperation of the ISS partners is absolutely amazing and serves as an example of a diverse community working together for common goals. Lastly, the ISS has enabled innovative U.S. companies to reinvent the launch industry. Further, crew private sector development, crew transportation systems with the aid of NASA are about ready to go fly. With all these amazing accomplishments from the ISS, it is only fitting that we take time to seriously plan for the transition of ISS and low Earth orbit. NASA is preparing to secure the nation's long-term presence in low Earth orbit by partnering with industry to develop commercial orbital platforms and capabilities that the private sector and NASA can utilize after the cessation of direct U.S. federal funding for ISS by 2025. To be clear, NASA is not abandoning low Earth orbit. We must ensure the right pieces are in place to maintain an operational human presence in low Earth orbit, whether through a modified ISS program, commercial platforms, or some combination of both government and commercial platforms. We are asking industry, academia, and others through a series of funded studies to provide ideas for utilizing the unique properties of space and creating commercial opportunities. We will work with the Space Council and the Department of Commerce to help with the transformation of low Earth orbit. We have also proposed funds in the 2019 budget to support this transition. NASA looks forward to working with the congressional stakeholders, other government agencies, researchers, private industry, and our international partners on the future of ISS and low Earth orbit to ensure that the U.S. maintains our human presence, our human leadership in space. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier, and Dr. Lal.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Bera, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. NASA's FY19 budget proposes to end direct financial support for the International Space Station by 2025 and transition to a commercially operated low Earth orbit capability. This transition can occur in two primary ways. The ISS could be privatized, as in all or parts of it could be taken over by a private entity and operated on behalf of the government, much like most DOE labs are today. Alternatively, a private sector entity could build, launch, and operate a commercial LEO-based platform for profit. In a recent study conducted at the Institute for Defense Analysis, Science and Technology Policy Institute, My colleagues, including Keith Crane, Benjamin Corbin, Reina Buenconsejo, and I, address the second option. Could a privately owned and operated, permanently crewed space station that may look nothing like the ISS generate sufficient revenues to cover its capital and operations costs without government subsidies? Our analysis identified 21 activities that could generate revenues from commercial or government customers on a LEO platform. We interviewed over 70 subject matter experts and built models to estimate the potential revenues that could be generated for each activity. We also estimated the costs of 2 possible configurations of a station that could house all of these activities. Our estimates of revenues and costs incorporated many assumptions, the most critical of which was a 50 to 75% reduction in the price of launch in the 2025 and beyond timeframe. Even with these aggressive assumptions, in 3 of the 4 scenarios we postulated, revenues did not cover costs. Venture capitalists we spoke to indicated that projected revenue streams are too far in the future and too uncertain to warrant making significant investments today. Overall, our analysis showed that it is unlikely that a commercial space station would be economically viable by 2025. There are some caveats that go with the finding. Some markets for space station-based products and services could experience more rapid growth than we assumed, and revenues could be greater than estimated. There is also a risk that products or services that are projected to generate large revenues might fail to do so. The growing availability of suborbital and parabolic flight opportunities, as well as temporary uncrewed orbital capsules, could both take away potential business away from a permanent station and at the same time provide an on-ramp to develop new markets. Last but not least, possible future Chinese or Russian space stations subsidized by their respective governments could also draw business opportunities away from a private space station. If a permanently crewed commercial space station in LEO is a critical element of United States leadership in space, without a ready commercial case in place by 2025, there are at least 3 options that merit further exploration. The ISS could be extended through 2028. Continuing to operate, maintain, and resupply the station will cost about $3 to $4 billion a year, which would take resources away from deep space exploration and affect the timeline for a return of U.S. astronauts to the moon. It may also take away opportunities from a rapidly burgeoning private sector that feels ready to lead activities in LEO. The ISS or modules within it could be privatized, with the private sector entity operating the station, but paid for largely by the government. Depending on how the deal is structured, this could in principle yield cost savings, although that cannot be assumed. As interviewees in our study indicated, the station was not designed to be operated inexpensively, and maintenance costs are likely to increase as elements are operated past their design lifetimes. Third, NASA could select a private entity to operate a commercial platform and rent space or request services as a tenant. While this option is best suited to help LEO commercialization, it will likely require some level of a government subsidy for the commercial operator. In our analysis, an annualized payment of about $2 billion could cover the cost of the platform, even in the case of 0 revenues. A deeper dive into the trade-offs among these options may be crucial before any permanent decisions on America's post-2024 LEO plans can be made. Thank you for the opportunity to share our analysis, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lal and Dr. Cantwell.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson.
Is your mic totally on there? Okay.
Good morning.
There it is.
Sorry, I always
Okay.
hear myself as very loud. Apologies. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, good morning. Members of the committee, Mr. Babin, Mr. Berra. It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting science to the table. I appreciate the opportunity to submit testimony and participate in the discussion. This is timely as the science community has just seen the delivery of the National Academy's report, a midterm assessment of implementation, and of the decadal survey of life and physical sciences research at NASA, which reviews the health and progress of the life and physical microgravity science portfolio in space. I was chair of the original decadal science study, which was delivered in 2011. And I currently sit on the oversight committee for this science portfolio within the National Academies, and I'm also a chair of the National Academy Science and Engineering Board. So I make the following comments. The U.S. has not conducted human operations on an extraterrestrial planetary body for close to 50 years. The opportunity to do this again and to have a meaningful life in physical sciences research program that enhances our ability to go back to the lunar surface and even further is frankly thrilling. The committee has heard a lot over the years about how the NASA-funded portfolio of life and physical sciences and microgravity has enabled our exploration missions, brought value to our lives on Earth, and delivered entirely new discoveries that have yielded new thinking for space and terrestrial efforts. Today, I'll discuss the implications of a potential shift to private sector platform providers as part of an increasingly privatized LEO ecosystem, and how this might be part of a continuing and successful microgravity sciences program if properly incentivized. The ISS is now a fully functioning science laboratory. It has a well-trained crew that understand the conduct of science. NASA has invested millions in building world-class research hardware assets. We should not waste these assets. It's additionally true that some microgravity and human spaceflight-related studies may well be suited for platforms other than the International Space Station, particularly if other long-duration platforms are available. Understanding the full cost of research asset investment, especially in the context of potential new costing and pricing paradigms that could be created during a transition from NASA-funded International Space Station to some of the options that Dr. Lal talked about, should be developed for NASA-supported science and technology in LEO, and should enable a range of space platforms, analogs, and even ground-based facilities. So far, it is almost always the case for discovery science and for unique mission-focused investigations, as NASA's exploration mission needs are. There is no commercial pull for the microgravity research portfolio. If NASA intends to purchase ISS or long-term LEO capabilities, what is now important is that microgravity exploration research be part of a coherent transition plan, a plan that understands that business models for research are not the same as those driving commercial interests, and a plan that recognizes the different perspectives on incentives for research. This could prevent unanticipated and, frankly, unrecoverable gaps in research capacity, and I particularly focus on the development of STEM workforce associated with those capacities. Finally, ISS research has not yet completely addressed the highest priorities of our decadal studies. The mid-decadal, which was published just recently, categorically finds that long-term microgravity studies are still lacking. Quoting from that study, with the totality of human exploration experience beyond LEO restricted to the Apollo era and the limited number of long-duration experiments conducted to date on the International Space Station, the need for microgravity and radiation space science is as strong now as ever. For exploration missions beyond LEO, we still need to better understand and better mitigate the long-term effects of spaceflight environments on both the biological and physical systems involved in extended missions in deep space and enabling operations and human performance without resupply on timescales measured in years. There is absolutely a need for integrated long-duration experimentation well beyond 2024. As stakeholder conversations are developed regarding this ISS transition process, we feel it's critical to include our research community, especially as decisions about new commercial pricing structures are made. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Cantwell. Let me recognize myself for questions and start off by addressing one to all of you all. And the question is this, and I hope you'll be very specific in your answer, and that is, what should we do about the ISS after 2024? But let me set this up and frame the question in a larger way. You've got NASA's budget at $20 billion, about 0.5% of our federal budget. We spend about $3.5 billion a year on the International Space Station. We cannot have a lunar mission. We cannot continue our exploration in the deep space unless we significantly increase that budget, which we should not presume that we are able to do. Therefore, we have to make some tough decisions. We cannot have it all. Federal funding is not unlimited. I know the administration is looking towards, on the transition, that the United States would be more of a customer than an operator. But if that is still going to cost us upwards of $2 billion, that's not much of a saving. That's not going to get us back to the moon. It's not going to get us elsewhere. So what do you think we should do about the International Space Station after 2024? And Mr. Gerstenmaier, let's start with you.
Okay, I think as we've kind of discussed earlier, and you can see in the transition report, we see the need for a continued activity in low Earth orbit for an extended period of time. I think, as we heard from some of the other witnesses here, that there's a need for a continuous presence to do research. We're not done in low Earth orbit. It enables what we need to do in deep space. Some of the systems that we're going to be using to go beyond the Earth-Moon system or used in the vicinity of the Moon, those absolutely need to be tested on space.
Okay, what is our continuing presence in low Earth orbit going to cost us?
Again, I think that's what we need to start really working very hard now to go look at these models that were described earlier. We need to take serious steps forward. I mentioned earlier in my testimony that we're going to do these, ask commercial companies for studies to come back, show us their business plan, show us their market analysis, show us what we think the cost would be for operations in low Earth orbit for NASA's defined needs.
In order to have sufficient funds to, say, go back to the moon, have a lunar mission, what would be the most we could spend for human presence in low Earth orbit?
Again, I think you could see what we're able to do today with Deep Space Gateway and those activities. We believe we can support where we are today with Space Station and those type of gateway activities heading towards the moon. And then as the SLS activities ramp down, the commercial crew activities ramp down, those development funds are reduced. We go into production and ops for SLS. That frees up funds that can be used for lunar surface activities and lunar landers. So I believe roughly at the budget we have now, with some consideration for inflation and economic growth, we can support a low Earth orbit program reduced somewhat, and also a lunar activity program.
Okay, and again, you're not willing to put a cost on the low Earth orbit human presence?
I can't give you a specific value. I think what we need to do is see what comes from industry, see what's reasonable, and then do the balance, the budget analysis.
My frustration is, it seems to me that we're continuing to think we can do it all, but we're not willing to put a cost on anything. That's just the frustration. Dr. Lal.
So Chairman Smith, as you said, a presence in low Earth orbit is not the same as having an ISS, and we absolutely need to do everything we can to see if there's a way for us to be in LEO without, it costing $3 to $4 billion a year. And so, look, having, as I said in my testimony, a better analysis of whether privatizing existing parts of the station would be more cost-effective versus having free flyers, commercial stations. And according to our study, the annualized cost of a commercial station would be about $2.25 billion. So that's something to be thinking about.
It's going to be considered, but then that's a saving of only about $1 billion, the difference between roughly 3.5 or 3.3 now and the 2.25 or whatever it might be. That doesn't seem to be, to me, I mean, $1 billion is a lot of money, but it's not necessarily going to pay for lunar mission and a mission into deep space beyond that. So I see that as maybe a difference without, a distinction without much of a difference, where it's still going to cost us over $2 billion. I think the savings have to be significant if you're going to pay for significant other missions. But do you want to respond to that?
So, I mean, I was talking about the cost. There's also potential revenues, which could be between $450 million to $1.2 billion. Again, we are talking 10 years out, and predictions are hard. But the net revenue could be between negative a few million to positive 700 million.
I still wonder that we're putting off the hard decisions, which isn't helpful to us, but I understand your position, so thank you for that. Dr. Cantwell.
I will say that two points first. The science portion of the budget is minuscule, and the science community is relatively agnostic as to what platform is used to conduct the science. So we have two real challenges. One is, right now, the International Space Station is the only platform to which the U.S. science community has access for long-term studies. So we would wish to see that there were other options, and the way that they are funded, we're relatively agnostic about, as long as the science community's overall costs are included in consideration of how those new developments, in terms of what I call business model, what's the confluence of our federally funded access as well as commercial support and other means for having U.S. presence in LEO.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. With that objection, I'd like to submit 2 letters for the record on America's human presence in low Earth orbit. One is from Dr. Gail Allen, Executive Director of the American Society for Gravitational and Space Research, and the other is from Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar, a noted expert on space flight programs. The gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for your testimony. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we now have an international space station transition plan that Congress mandated and NASA delivered. While the plan, as it is called, lays out several issues, it raises even more questions that need to be answered. To start with, the administration is proposing to end direct U.S. financial support for the space station in 2025. I'd like you to comment on what that means, how much international input you've had, and if sufficient private funding is not forthcoming to compensate for the loss of that government support. Does the administration plan to deorbit the ISS? And will the administration decide to keep the financial support going, and if so, how much longer? This is not just a U.S. decision, or it shouldn't be because it's an international contract. So I'd like each of you to comment on how far we've gone and including those stakeholders in this design for the future of the ISS.
The International Space Station program has had numerous discussions with our international partners about the future of ISS and what our plans are beyond 2024 into 2025. We've reached no firm decisions, or discussions have not resulted in firm decisions moving forward. They understand what our thinking is and our plans. If you look in the transition report, in addition to the date and the discussion about ending direct funding in 2025, there's a series of principles that are called out in that transition report, and we think those principles are very important, and the international partner community agrees with those general principles. So I think we've had a discussion about what we need in low Earth orbit. I think our international partners agree with us. We need some presence in low Earth orbit. They also are working with us to go build standards and also to move out into deep space. So they see this tension between us needing to stay in low Earth orbit and willing to move human presence in the solar system, and we're actively engaged with them in working the items that you discussed.
I guess my only comment to your question would be the last time the space station was extended in 2014 from 2020 to 2024, it wasn't clear at all if all the partners were going to join us in extending the station, and it is certainly not clear now if they would be willing to extend, given that they all have plans to partner with us on deep space and lunar exploration plans. And that is something that's an important consideration, given that some percent of the O&M budget of the station is paid for by the international partners. So their considerations are very important in this decision going forward.
Just one comment. The science community is relatively inherently international and shares science assets on the space station. So the biggest comment I would have, the concern of the community, is that if a transition point was selected and held as a matter of course, that we experience a gap in capacity to conduct, that continuity, science continuity is not available, both for funded science that trains people as well as the conduct of experiments.
Okay. What would a private company, what would make the private company interested in picking up a $3 billion annual cost of supplying, operating, and maintaining a part of the U.S. Portion of the expense for the space station? Have you had any private companies express that interest?
Yeah, Ken, I think we're starting to see on board Space Station today interest in private companies in utilizing the unique properties of space for potential revenue-generating activities. There's been discussed some manufacturing things earlier, and those look like they may have promise. We've seen some pharmaceutical interest, et cetera. So there's some beginning small interest in utilizing space for these companies to generate some revenue. I think we have to be careful when we think about what we continue in low Earth orbit after the space station. we can't probably continue a facility as large as the space station. It took us a tremendous amount of time to build this space station. I think we'll end up with much smaller space stations. Transportation costs are critical, as been discussed in these by the other members here. So we need to reduce those costs. But I think we can get the operating costs down, and there's potential that we could get some cost sharing in this time frame. Whether they could take the full cost burden, I don't think so. But there could be some initial things that help lower the burden, and even a small savings helps us advance what we want to do in deep space.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I want, if you'll send me the answer to this question of the private commercial companies who've expressed an interest in taking up the U.S.'s responsibility. If you'll just mail that to me, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, we can do that, and we've officially requested that through this NASA research announcement, or will be requesting it through a NASA research announcement for studies. We'll provide you a list of all the potential providers to that, or response to that.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
We're spending $3 billion a year. How much are our partners spending?
Probably $1 billion to $2 billion collectively across all the partnerships.
And could you list those partners for us, please?
It would be Canada, Russia, Japan, and then the European Space Agency.
So the total cost is more like $4.5 to $5 billion a year rather than $3 billion a year.
Yes.
Right. So this is, and after a certain number of years, now we're talking about what, 7 and 8 years from now, we have this big chunk of metal up there, and something has to be done with it, and there's no way that we can just turn this over to anyone and say, well, that's a $4.5 billion expenditure that you can assume the payments at this point, because what's being done can't generate that kind of revenue. Is that correct?
Again, today's studies and today's analysis don't show that that revenue can be generated.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Today's analysis shows that that can't be generated. And
Right.
maybe
So we have other things we want to do in space. Are we just simply saying today, and Mr. Chairman, are we simply saying today that this has been, I mean, I was here, I remember, don't want to brag, but I think it was my vote in this committee that was the pivotal vote that moved the project forward all those years ago. So we just say, those of us who are here and have been involved in this project, well, it was worthwhile, it's run its course, time to leave it behind. Is that what we're talking about?
I mean, this is precisely why the administration took the position that it did. We think now is the time to start looking at what options are available to us, see what we can get from the private sector, see what they can do, ask them for their ideas. Are there smaller instantiation of space station? Could they use a piece of space station to satisfy their needs and leverage and build an economy in low Earth orbit? Now is the time to start that planning, so in the next 7 years, we have an approach and we can understand what the residual costs we still need to carry on our side and what can be covered by the private sector and how it can meet our needs. So I think the reason we took the position we did in the transition report and set the date of 2025 was essentially to begin a serious discussion to make sure that we are ready to transition low Earth orbit in some entity to a sustainable thing that meets all the objectives and gives us the benefit out of low Earth orbit that we absolutely need for deep space. And now is the time to work that. I think we have enough time in front of us. We'll ask the private sector to get creative and innovative and help us figure out what to go do. We know the major drivers and cost in the model, and we can turn that over to the private sector and see if they can come up with ways to address some of those costs and reduce them, and see where we end up in the next seven years or so.
Either of you have a comment on that?
I guess I would just like to say that when folks talk about commercial stations, they're not talking about something as big as ISS. You know, the commercial stations that we learned about in our study were a third the size of the ISS, more like the Skylab. They were a 20th the mass of the ISS. And with those kind of platforms, it is feasible to generate adequate revenues that with some amount of government payment that they could be commercially viable, but not ISS sized.
Very quick comment. In the science community, what we've seen over the last 6 years is what I will characterize as the CASIS experiment, and it has absolutely yielded an increasing level of understanding and knowledge about how some components of the ISS capacity can be attractive to commercial entities. So I would point to two things. One is it takes a little time, and the other is that we do have the capacity to begin to look at these things from, I won't call them experiments, but we can query the commercial sector and get good answers.
Let me just note that this project, it's been an interesting project to follow all the way through as I have. If it indicates one thing, that we have learned how to construct big projects in space, which could well serve humankind in the future. And I believe that we have lots of challenges that we need. I've been trying to always remind people that we could see an asteroid heading toward the Earth, and we need to be able to deflect something like that threat. Or there are things that we will be capable of in the future that we're not capable of now, and it might require us to have these skills that we've developed in major construction project in space. So I'm watching, and Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership over these years in this project. And I like the answer. The fact is, we're looking ahead now, and we want to have as many creative ideas as we possibly can to meet this challenge, so that what's left of the space station's mission is not a waste. But so far, we've learned a lot, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Bear, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there are a couple truths here that I think Dr. Cantwell talked about. One truth, which is from the scientific community, they're agnostic, other than they need a platform under which to conduct these long-term experiments, whether it's long-term microgravity exposure or radiation exposure, and there ought not to be a gap in that. Again, if we have we're articulating longer-term, multi-decadal goals in mind. So as part of this conversation, ISS, no ISS, I think we have to say, okay, what is that? What is that replacement that allows us to continue from a scientific research and discovery perspective, these longer-term studies. I also, just another truth, and I think as we're having this conversation, I don't disagree with the chairman that resources are limited. And we're talking about federal funding versus commercial versus international support in an isolated conversation, the ISS, but I think we ought to talk about it in terms of the entire conversation about space, because today when we talk about a return to a lunar mission, it's different than it was in the days of Apollo, where NASA was the launch vehicle, was the landing vehicle, was the science component. Today you have multiple launch vehicles that potentially fill that piece of the lunar mission. I suspect that we will have commercial landing vehicles as well. So, in that context, and you will likely have international launch vehicles and landing vehicles as well. So, how do we not just have the budget conversation in isolation around ISS, but also look at, are there ways to defray costs on the, NASA by itself doesn't just have to do the lunar mission. There'll be commercial and international entities in that conversation as well. And I think those are incredibly important. And I also think another component that we should not lose sight of is, I'm told that, thus far we've spent $87 billion in assembly, in, development and operations of the ISS. Those are sunk costs that the taxpayers have already invested. we should not be short-sighted to say, those are not costs that you're going to recover if we've already spent those sunk costs. We ought to think about that in the context of our return on investment as well, because, again, you don't have to replicate that $87 billion of assembly, and that should be a component here. Am I thinking about this correctly, Mr. Gerstenmaier? And then I'd be curious about,
Yeah, I think you bring up some very, very good points. I think we also sometimes think of this as a lunar activity or a low Earth orbit activity. I think we ought to think of it more as a combined activity. So when I talked about standards, if we can now build components that will operate on station that will be used in the lunar system. So the life support systems that the crews, the next generation of life support systems used on the International Space Station, those will be identical systems used in the lunar station. So there is not a one-for-one duplication in the costs associated with lunar and low Earth orbit. They're effectively one system used in both places. So I think if we think about this in a broader sense, we can look for a sustainable plan that allows us to operate and look at the total budget that we have for NASA and look at it as an activity that we have to do both a lunar program and a low Earth orbit program. Don't look at them as separate activities, and see if we can figure out a creative way to utilize those together to achieve our end goal.
Great. Dr. Cantwell, do you want to add?
I would only add one really general comment and back it up with a little bit of fact, which is that we are, as a country, absolutely capable of innovating our way through this. We've seen it happen in the past. It is an incredibly challenging problem, but I do think that we can do that. Now, I would back that up with a little bit of a geeky discussion about 3D printing in space, which we are seeing a manufacturing revolution, and that revolution is associated, quite honestly, with the full digitization of manufacturing. The implications of that for planetary missions are quite astounding, and we have only really intellectually touched that. While we've done a little bit of manufacturing in space, intellectually, the implications of that are really amazing. We have many examples of that kind of thing.
Well, so let's, as we in Congress have this conversation in concert with NASA and others, let's make sure we're open to our imagination and we're looking at the full scope of this, and that it's not just $3 billion a year of funding until 2024, and then we shut the lights off. But it could even be a transition where in 2020 it's $2 billion and there's other sources of revenue coming in. So we shouldn't see it as either or, and we should look at it in the entire context as technology improves. So I'll yield back. Thanks, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Barra. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. NASA's first Commercial Resupply Services Contract, or CRS-1, awarded International Space Station cargo resupply contracts to SpaceX and Orbital Sciences, now Orbital ATK. At the time of the award, both were using expendable or one-time use launch vehicles. Commercial Resupply Services Contract number 2 awards were announced in 2016, with Orbital ATK, SpaceX, and Sierra Nevada receiving contracts. A recent audit by the NASA Office of Inspector General found that, quote, overall, CRS-2 costs are still projected to be roughly $350 million higher than CRS-1, end quote. With regards to each contractor, the audit notes, quote, when compared to the cost of each contractor's final CRS-1 mission, SpaceX's average pricing per kilogram will increase approximately 50% under CRS-2, while Orbital ATK's average cost per kilogram pricing will decrease by roughly 15%, end quote. SpaceX appears to be using reusable launch vehicles for CRS-2. In your opinions, why have expected costs for SpaceX's reusable launch vehicles gone up so much when reusability was supposed to save the government money?
Again, I think what you're seeing here is kind of market forces at work. When the original CRS-1 contracts were bid, I'm not sure the contractors really knew what it cost to launch a cargo to space. In fact, there were no rockets available to do that task. So they gave us a proposal, we accepted that proposal, and they delivered on that proposal. Then in the second round, they have a better understanding of what those costs are, and we see some of those costs coming back. From a government standpoint, we look at that, we look at price reasonableness. We got good value and good reasonableness. I think what it shows us is there's a strong tool on the government side, and that's competition. If we can set ourselves up in the future for future contracts and other activities where there's good competition, then that allows us to put some pressure on the commercial sector and the private sector to lower costs and still give us the services we need moving forward. So I think we're learning through this process of how to interact and how to contract and get our activities in place. I don't see these changes as a big deal. These are just natural progressions and changes that will occur through contracting, but we on the government side can use that to our advantage as we think about how we're going to get next generation of modules, next generation of systems used in space.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, if I understood you correctly then, it's your belief that the price increases for SpaceX were more market force driven as opposed to the use of reusable launch vehicles versus one-time use launch vehicles.
That's my opinion, yes.
Dr. Cantwell, based on your interactions with industry, how do you foresee the odds of a commercially viable human presence in low Earth orbit absent any government support doing?
Caveat, the science community would be the place where you would not seek expert opinion on the commercial approach. We have, on the committees that I've served, queried mostly new space companies over the last 3 or 4 years, seeing this transition coming. And what we find, I will just say that what we find is a unique willingness to work with the science community to find ways as we progress and innovate these new business models to accommodate science. That has certainly not come to any clear conclusions at this point, but we do find that particularly American companies are more than interested in supporting American science.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, as I understand it, the inclination of the International Space Station limits its use for staging, assembly, or logistics for further human deep space exploration. Would a future human presence in low Earth orbit in a different orbit create new useful options for an American human presence in low Earth orbit, or is there no relationship regardless of the inclination?
The inclination directly affects the amount of mass you can take to orbit, but once you overcome that, the ability to go from a 51.6 degree inclination to the moon and other activities, or 28.5, is not that radically different going from those orbits outward. But there is a small impact of the launch mass impact going to the higher inclination orbit. So I don't see inclination as a big driver. It takes away some of your performance for the initial launch, but in the big scheme of things, either inclination can be workable. We've been able to work very well in the 51.6 degree inclination.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier and Dr. Cantwell. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you for those questions. Now I'll recognize the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cantwell, in reading your testimony, I was struck by certain things, and let me explain. You seem to have a concern about how we're going to start to transition. You even used references to research and how we go from where we are now, basically LEO type of situation, into deep space. In particular, what I was struck by is it looked like the whole space station issue started like in the mid-1980s, and there's negotiations going on, and you finally have human inhabitants by the year 2000. And you seem to say in your testimony that right now, we are finally now, I think it's the exact words that you use, in a fully functioning laboratory with a well-trained crew that understands the conduct of science. So my concern is as we transition from what we have now to deep space kind of exploration, how long do you think we're going to get them? How long will it take for us to get there from what you seem to have a great concern about? if I'm reading you correctly.
So I always characterize my remarks not so much as concern, but as pointing to those capacities that are necessary for science to be conducted, and the general flag waving that says, please don't forget that the science community needs certain things. It is a small piece of the budget, but needs certain things in order to do the work that would allow us to, for instance, successfully go back to the moon and on to Mars. I will perhaps restate something I said a little bit earlier, which is that the major concern or pointer is that the International Space Station today, which in my remarks meant a fully functioning, it is meeting all of the science requirements it was established to do at this point. And that is a relatively recent fact. All of the science assets have been brought up and emplaced, and the science that has been thought about for many years can be conducted now. And this is true in just really in the last asset was probably, Mr. Gerstenmaier can help better than I am, but in the last couple of years. So we have an asset that can now do the long duration studies. Those are the studies that will underpin and support our capacity to spend more than the amounts of time that we have had astronauts on the station, as well as to have equipment, engineered systems that can function for long periods of time without resupply. And that is as relevant to lunar surface operations over long durations, and then the studies that we will need to do to go further out. Just as a point of reference, we could imagine doing long-term studies in a lunar gateway type of platform, but it would cost us a lot more to get those studies out there and bring them back for reinvestigation.
One of the statements you made, I think this was in response to Congressman Bera's questioning, you said that basically you have faith that as a country we can innovate our way through all of this. I think those were your exact words. And I guess what I'm reading in all the testimonies, especially in yours, is that, you know, it's as a country, we're no longer seem to be talking about space in terms of the United States or Russia or any one country. We seem to have gone past that, and we are talking about science in a global or international way, whichever you want to talk about it. And this whole space exploration is also taking on that kind of, I guess, cooperation in order for us to succeed. It seems to be inherent in how we have evolved. Now, in light of that, and you may not be, I'm pretty sure you're going to respond to me that scientists are not the ones to respond to this, but given that, how is it, given the temperature of our relationships, because this is based on how countries are getting along, how do you see that affecting the conclusion that you seem to arrive at, which is that we can innovate our way through all of this?
So let me start with the conclusion, because I have been party over my career, now a pretty long career, to innovation through difficult federal pricing challenges, all the way to I now work at what by any stretch would be characterized as an incredibly innovative university with regard to the conduct of higher education, another grand challenge for the United States. But the fact is that innovation is a mindset as much as anything else. We have the intellectual capacity in the U.S., and we have, frankly, we have the dollars in the U.S. It is a mindset. So I will say what you expected me to say, but I think the reason that the science community is so international and global is that the science community is driven by the marketplace of ideas. We, you know, by curiosity, by discovery, and by the delivery of that curiosity and those discovery principles into things that matter. Typically, those really aren't defined by national boundaries.
Thank you. My time is up. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lau, well, let me do it this way first. Mr. Gerstenmaier, am I saying that right? In your discussion with Congressman Rohrabacher, you made the statement, we absolutely have need the benefit of low Earth orbit for deep space. Why is that?
again, you've kind of heard it from some of the other panel members, but it's very difficult to do research and new development around the moon. Just the transportation costs of getting there are much, much higher than they are in low Earth orbit. The cost of doing that activity is much more difficult. Doing that development activity in low Earth orbit is exactly the right place to do that, and then you can take that, and after it's developed, then extend it to the lunar vicinity.
Right, okay, so you're reiterating, I got that. Do you know the ISS, what its footprint or its cubic feet is, or how big it is?
It's roughly the size of a 5-bedroom house. Internal dimensions, lengthwise, it's about the size of a football field.
Weight,
900,000 pounds.
longevity, how long does it last in space?
We have studies that shows that it can last structurally till 2028 and probably be extended beyond 2028.
Will it fall to Earth eventually?
If we don't reboost it, our plan is to either deconstruct it, bring it apart in pieces, use those pieces for some other application, or deorbit it essentially as a large piece safely into the ocean.
Well, if you deorbit it into the ocean, does most of it burn up?
Yes, majority of it would burn up. Some small pieces would probably make the surface.
Majority, you can keep your mic on for a minute.
All right, sure.
Majority being, when you say majority of it would burn up, 60, 70, 80%?
Probably 90% or so, maybe even 95%. There's several large structural components. There's some large structural titanium pieces and some large aluminum structure that probably would make the surface of the Earth based on our models.
Okay, but we would still maintain the capability of steering that, for lack of a better term, into where we wanted it to go.
Yeah, we would steer that such that the footprint would be over the Pacific Ocean, and it actually stretches multiple miles. We actually look at a descent profile that would stretch a couple 100 miles across the ocean of where the debris potentially could land. We've actually investigated that with some of our cargo vehicles. When they return, they also are destructively burned up. We have purposely lowered the angle of attack of which those vehicles come into the atmosphere to make them shallower, similar to what the station would be. So we'll actually know what that quantified footprint is, so we can ensure that when station is destructively re-entered, it can not impact any human inhabitants on the Earth.
Okay, Doc, you can turn your mic off now. Dr. Linnell, would you say your report essentially ruled out the idea of a commercial space station and that we should definitely pursue privatization?
Our report ruled out a fully commercially viable station, as in without any government subsidies, the commercial sector will not make any money.
Is it based on the space station he just described?
Absolutely not. The station that was part of our model is about a third the size, 330 cubic meters rather than 930 cubic meters.
It's smaller.
A third the size, and it's also a 20th the mass. As I said earlier, commercial stations, I mean, space stations, Battlestar Galactica. Commercial parties may not need that.
Okay. Okay. Let me go to Dr. Cantwell. Do you think that the difference in operations among different low Earth orbit use cases suggests that a few smaller purpose-built private facilities, more than one, may succeed where a larger general purpose platform is not viable on a purely commercial basis?
I'll attempt to answer that more as an engineer, if you
Sure.
will go with that. There are operational requirements which could be met by a small number or even a large number of alternative platforms. The challenge is the cost of the people who are conducting those experiments on orbit, the launch cost to get the scientific material up there and back. So we've recommended a sort of a full cost assessment of the needed science for this very reason. You can then look at, can it be conducted in what are established as a series of platforms.
Okay, I'm getting really low on time, but let me just, so if you had one in a certain orbit, I don't know how many miles that would be, if you expanded the next one above it to 10 miles, 20 miles further out, would there be benefits, obviously, in having 3 different layers, for example, of orbits?
There could be for certain science. I would say that, again, the massive driver for all of this from the science perspective for human exploration missions is the duration of time in microgravity that studies can be conducted. and the radiation environment. So there would be a difference if you went high enough in the radiation.
Are you able to quantify that, the difference in radiation and the different?
I don't know that we've actually looked at it specifically from that perspective, but the mid-decadal study does characterize the radiation studies that are needed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Sir, thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I was governor of Florida in the years leading up to the retirement of the Space Shuttle. I remember the apprehension with which many throughout our state viewed the end of that program. As it turns out, that apprehension was in fact warranted. Not only did the loss of the shuttle depress Florida's economy, but it hurt the families who worked on the shuttle as well as those who worked in industries supported by the program like tourism. Thankfully, Florida's blessed with the talent to innovate in challenging circumstances, and now we have a thriving commercial space industry to fill that void. However, much like the shuttle, I'm sure there will be job losses or realignments as a result of the decommissioning of the space station. Mr. Gerstenmaier, what is NASA's plan for those workers and their families who will be affected by the transition? Will there be a workforce transition plan for them? And if so, when can we expect to see one?
Again, I think as we've discussed in our transition report, we have some principles laid out for what the physical facility would be in space. Then I think after we understand kind of what the concept is we want in space, then we need to start working on the terrestrial plans to provide for what you described, to make sure we've got a good transition where they may be government jobs today, they may be private sector jobs today, much as you've seen in Florida, that transition occurred. I think we could do a better and smoother job of that on the ground. And so we can plan for that. Same thing as we move into deep space, some of the detailed engineering, some of the hard sciences, there's going to be a new demand for new students, new engineers in those areas, and we can start bringing those online. So we need to do a phased-in transition and don't do just a stop and then wait and then figure out what the plan is moving forward. So we will do that next step of transition planning after I believe we lay out kind of our general concept of how we want to do exploration.
Thank you, sir. My next question is directed to all the witnesses. Do you think there will be enough demand to support commercial activity in low Earth orbit following the end of space station operations? What are the barriers to generating that demand? And what do you envision will be the primary driver of such a market?
I can answer a piece of it. From the NASA perspective, I think we have an understanding of what activities we'd like to continue to do in low Earth orbit, even beyond the station. So we need a place to train crews, to give them experience of operating in space. As Dr. Cantwell talked about, I think we need a station to do some research that's done close to Earth that can get there with lower transportation costs. That augments what research we could be doing in a gateway type of activity around the moon. So I think we understand the NASA demand. What we need to do is see if the private sector can, on their own, determine some demand that they want to have for research activities in space or from operations in space that they can get benefit from. Then that total combined demand, both government and private sector, makes up the plans moving forward. And we're going to ask in some studies for exactly that market analysis from companies.
So in our study, the 21 activities we looked at, there were 3 that stood out as having, solid demand behind them. One is optical fiber, exotic fiber. A second one is satellite assembly, and a third one is sovereign astronauts and private astronauts. So three that stood out in terms of demand. And with respect to the barriers, launch cost is the biggest barrier to a commercially viable space station.
The only thing I would add is that if we have, as I believe we should, a continuing research presence in LEO, then we will, this is not probably within the next decade, but research tends to pull out new applications that commercial companies are very interested in. The place that I would really point to for the likelihood of that is in material science.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, the transition report speaks to the importance of the space station and low Earth orbit to both research entities and the commercial space launch industry. Would you please describe NASA's commitment to ensuring there will not be any gap or reduction in continuous crew and cargo access to the low Earth orbit, regardless of platform?
Again, what we're looking at is we described there's a budget laid out, the commercialization budget that starts at $150 million in 2019. That's to laid out to try to see what is needed from the private sector in terms of another facility other than station, or do they want to use space station, or do they want to use some combination of space station and another facility? To service those entities, we're going to need a commercial launch capability. As we talk about activities around the moon, we don't need to go look at cargo again from a government-only program. We can go immediately to cargo for lunar activities at Gateway using commercial providers. So there's a natural meshing between what we've done in low Earth orbit and what can be done around the moon. They can take dramatically less cargo to the moon, but it's still, with the rockets they have today, they can get cargo that can be substantial for us and needed around the moon. So I think we'll take that transportation market we've established and figure out creative ways to use it both for low Earth orbit and also for our deep space activities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to yield myself here 5 minutes for questions. The first one is to you, Mr. Gerstenmaier. There are approximately 1,370 civil servants and 4,725 reportable contractors supporting the ISS program in FY18. Many are located in my district, Johnson Space Center in Houston. Yesterday, you were asked in the Senate testimony how mission control at Johnson Space Center would be impacted by an ISS transition. You stated that NASA's intent is for mission control being conducted at Johnson Space Center for all future HEO programs, and that there would be no major impact. And I would like to ask you to elaborate on that for us as well in this hearing.
Yeah, what I was alluding to as we talk about the Gateway activity around the moon, that vehicle that'll be around the moon, that can be in multiple different orbits around the moon. It's not like a space station. It can be in different orbits. That will be commanded and operated from the Johnson Space Center through the mission control teams. Just as the Johnson Space Center played a critical role in understanding how we do rendezvous and proximity operations in low Earth orbit, they set all the operating procedures for how that would be developed, how we routinely keep crews healthy in low Earth orbit and those activities. All those things will carry into deep space. So that fundamental research and analysis that needs to be done on how you use the gravity of the Earth and the moon and the sun to maneuver and manipulate around to save propellant, all that will be done by the scientists and researchers at the Johnson Space Center. So that that pioneering of how we get comfortable of keeping humans in deep space, how we learn to essentially maneuver and manipulate across the gravity rivers in space to other deep space locations, all that will be done by the teams at the Johnson Space Center.
Thank you very much. I think, Dr. Lal, first for you, NASA benefits from commercial partnerships and can help with a lot of early technical development, but are the medium to late stage economic development of space the responsibility of NASA, another part of the government, or not a government responsibility at all?
That's a good question. It depends on the particular area and the context of the space station. I think there's enough experience that this is a transition that can begin to happen. There are companies that have whose leadership has been part of NASA, has learned lessons from the station. NASA is willing to offer expertise through Space Act agreements and other ways. So this would be an area where there's potentially little enough R&D that it could be outside of the government. And of course, we're talking about operating the platform. There's also the launch service where we've seen that the commercial sector can do a pretty good job. And on the user base, again, NASA is working on developing R&D, users of R&D in commercial areas or even universities where things can move forward without government support.
Okay, thank you. And then this is for all of you, should the United States commit to maintaining a human presence, commit to it, whether public, private, whether permanent or periodic in low Earth orbit? Mr. Gerstenmaier, you first.
I think there's
Yes
a
or
need,
no?
I think there's a need for us to stay in low Earth orbit as we go beyond low Earth orbit. So again, I think as you described fairly clearly at the beginning, it's not an either-or situation. I think we need to do both, and we need to figure out a way to accomplish both.
Okay. Well, let me follow up with you while you've got the mic. If the United States doesn't maintain a presence in light of Chinese plans for a LEO space station as early as 2022, are we ceding U.S. leadership?
Again, I think we can still maintain leadership in the deep space activities. There would be some potential damage if we relied on another entity for operations in low Earth orbit.
Okay. And then I'll tell you what, I'll go to Dr. Cantwell next, and then if I have time, Dr. Lyle. Should the United States commit to maintaining a human presence, whether public, private, permanent, periodic, in low Earth orbit? Dr. Cantwell, very quickly.
I think the opinion of my community and my personal opinion is yes. And the reason is that it is the most accessible location with which to do research of interest, and it is the least expensive.
Okay.
So we can get answers to our questions and discover new things faster if we have LEO presence.
Thank you. Dr. Lyle.
Robert Heinlein said low Earth orbit is halfway to anywhere. I agree with him. We absolutely need to have low Earth orbit presence. It doesn't have to be government-led. We need it for R&D on Earth. We need it to R&D for the future, and we need it to be as a gateway to the rest of the solar system.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And that exhausts my time. So, gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the committee for holding this important hearing. I hail from Connecticut, and we actually do, in my state, provide life support services for ISS. We have a long-time commitment around space. Research aboard the International Space Station is critical to our journey to Mars, and an important aspect of that research will help us develop countermeasures to the harsh environments astronauts will be facing during long periods of spaceflight. And earlier last year, I met with Captain Mark Kelly and discussed with him the important research with his twin brother and the effects that we're beginning to understand about even a relatively short, compared to what we're talking about for a Mars mission, experienced an exposure to microgravity. In Connecticut, the NASA Connecticut Space Grant Consortium has awarded a grant to undergraduate students in our state to carry out a project called The Effect of Microgravity on Nanoparticle Cellular Interaction, which aims to research the effects of microgravity on human health. And this project will use an imaging procedure to look at nanoparticles and their interaction with proteins in human cells and freeze them in time to then capture images and assess them later. Now, a lot of us are concerned about what's happening about the wind down of ISS. And really, Mr. Gerstenmaier, for you first, will the essential ISS research and development needed to enable deep space, human space exploration have been accomplished by 2025? And is NASA equipped to stay on track to complete a checklist of countermeasures on microgravity in that time period?
Our current timelines show that we can complete the majority of activities by 2025. There's not much margin in activities. And then also, I think there could potentially is a need for some continued research for long duration periods, even beyond the 2025 timeframe.
Do you have thoughts of how we're going to achieve that? Because once we don't have ISS, we don't have any good mechanism for studying that.
Again, I think as we've discussed in this hearing, we look for commercial platforms that can be an avenue to go take a look in those investigations. We also have a need to understand some things needed to go beyond the Earth-Moon system. So the gateway that we talk about, another facility around the moon, we think that also has application now to look at some animal models for the radiation environment around the moon, et cetera, that will help us understand what the environment is and countermeasures for that period. So I think we have a continued need for research activities in space.
Well, I think it's going to be very important for Congress and this committee to be kept apprised of that timetable. And that's part of our concern, frankly, when we had the NASA reauthorization without having even reviewed the report about how that transition is going to go from the end of ISS. A number of us are part of the newly formed Planetary Caucus in Congress, and we met last week and interacted with stakeholders and experience groups. And one of the issues they raised was the important and often under-attended to aspect of cooperation between nations that's occurred because of ISS. Something that there is absolutely no, as far as I can tell, any indication that that is likely to happen as part of commercial endeavors. Would any of you care to talk about that as we are one sole planet? As somebody mentioned last week, we have no planet B. So part of the value of ISS, it seems to me, has been the importance of having scientists working across countries, which are not always friendly on all other terms, but maintaining that level of human space exploration, human exploration. And if any of you would care to comment on that, because that's one of those pieces, again, not clearly in the jurisdiction of this committee, but clearly in the importance and interest of the American people and this government, and part of the planning, frankly. If we're winding down ISS, how are we going to be dealing with inter-country cooperation on this incredibly important human endeavor?
Again, I think the space station has shown us that we can work together as an international community despite government challenges between us. And I think the challenge of human spaceflight, the challenge of putting humans in space and keeping them alive and keeping them safe draws us together and allows us to work together as a community that probably can't be accomplished in any other way. And the ISS partnership is tremendously strong. It has built international standards for new hardware and new equipment, which will allow any country, no matter how small they are, to build new hardware for deep space activities. We've also worked with the international community for the Orion service module. That's the system that propels the Orion in deep space. That's being built by the European Space Agency. We put them in a critical path for our human activities. So you're already seeing us start to carry forward on the ISS experience into deep space. And I think, as was discussed earlier here in this hearing, that any future activities in deep space will be an international activity, and that's only because Station has shown that that's a viable way of cooperating and working together.
I do think the concern, though, is if we don't have something in the interim, ISS drops out, we don't yet have the longer-term projects, and then we're left in the interim with commercial space, individual countries moving forward, and I think that's an under-attended to issue. I know my time has expired, but that's something we haven't really been talking about and was really present with longtime partners last week saying this doesn't get discussed enough about the importance for the standards, but frankly for this being a human endeavor that we engage in together. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence.
Thank you. Now I'll call on a gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panel members, thank you for appearing before us today. The human presence in the low Earth orbit is crucial as we advance exploration to the moon and beyond. And I'm concerned about the way monies are invested in low Earth orbit research. My research indicates that roughly 60% of the total operating cost for the International Space Station is transportation to and from the station. Dr. Cantwell, is that true?
I think I might, I am probably not the best person to ask about transportation costs, but I believe Dr. Lal has actually looked at this in her study.
So, I mean, today, NASA, the ISS budget, I think $1 billion is operational and management, and 1.7 is transportation, crew, and cargo. So, yeah, sounds about right.
All right, so the need for research is crucial as we look to the future for human presence in space, lunar orbit, lunar surface, Mars exploration, et cetera. And a great deal of this research can be conducted for those missions to be successful in low Earth orbit. And our goal as this body and this committee is to encourage the dollars to be invested in actual research, and what can we do to decrease the expense of transportation to and from the research, which absorbs so much of the dollars. NASA is not currently confident that private sector capabilities have matured enough to satisfy NASA's needs and requirements for low Earth orbit operations. Is that true, Dr. Cantwell?
Again, this is what we heard from Mr. Gerstenmaier a little bit earlier today. I would say this is the concern of the science community, and it is not a concern in the sense that our hair is on fire. It is a concern that as we look at the multiplicity of options for reducing the costs to the U.S. government of launch and carrying things to and from whatever LEO objects we have, that the science community is part and parcel of those considerations.
So what steps should NASA and private industry take to reduce these costs to ensure the efficient commercial use of the ISS or whatever next generation low Earth orbit program is government-funded program, manifest after in the post-ISS era? What steps can we take that we're not doing right now? Anyone?
Again, I think we're pursuing these steps as fast as we can. We're working right now with commercial crew, right? Probably within 1 year, we'll have 2 providers being able to carry crew to low Earth orbit. As we think to the future beyond low Earth orbit, we think transportation is clearly a key driver. So we want to make sure that there's not unique systems, that the systems used for low Earth orbit can be basically the same systems used for deep space. We also think that the past model where we have lots of disposable hardware that we used, for example, in the Apollo program, if we can use the gateway where it now enables, or it's a piece of infrastructure that allows reusability in space, we might be able to actually even use some upper stages from rockets as part of the components used to build facilities in space. If we start looking for creative ways where
Excellent.
we
That's
utilize
creative
pieces,
thought. That's what the
we can
committee
lower some costs.
was hoping to hear. Dr. Gerstenmaier, by 2024, regarding the ISS, several components of the ISS will be nearly 26 years old, twice as long as its expected lifespan. Should NASA and other U.S. commercial entities remain on the current ISS under a modified program, what safety concerns do you have regarding the aging components of the ISS, and what measures should be taken by either NASA or private industry to ensure continued safe operation?
We continually monitor all these systems on board Space Station, and we routinely change them out as time is needed. We've upgraded all the computer systems on board Space Station. As recently as yesterday, we did a spacewalk. And what we did with that spacewalk is we located some pump packages in a region where they can now be changed by robotic activities on station. So if one of these pump systems goes down or breaks, we don't have to do an emergency spacewalk with crews. These are now positioned in a location where we can replace that pump that failed robotically from the ground and restore full functionality of stations. So the teams are continually looking forward to figure out ways they can lower the risk, understanding that components may break and they may fail. We'll have replacement components on board. We'll have staffing or spares available to go replace those components as needed and upgrade as needed.
Thank you for your very thorough answer. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And this concludes our hearing today. I want to thank each and every one of you excellent witnesses. We really appreciate it. And the great questions from our members up here. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional written comments and written questions from members. So with that, this hearing is adjourned.